As Brenda introduced me, my name is Sanford Hess. I am the IT director for the city of Urbana in Illinois. And I do want to thank Brenda for pronouncing that right. We do say Urbana in Illinois. And as my bio mentioned, I spent 20 years before I came, I've been with the city for 7 years, but for 20 years before that, I was working for a government finance system vendor doing ERP projects. So today in my talk, I want to emphasize that I'm speaking both as one of you to GMIS government members and also GMIS corporate members. And I'm going to have parts of my talk for each of you. I want to start off by giving credit where credit is due in terms of the name of this talk. It is called Getting to Know, but obviously that's a takeoff of the wonderful book called Getting to Yes, written by Roger Fisher and William Ury. Just a quick plug for this book. It's a short one, first of all, but it's a wonderful book on a completely different topic than I'm talking about today, which is negotiating. And just because I want to plug the book, I'm going to give you the incredibly condensed version of the book, which is Know Your BATNA. So the BATNA definition is probably important. A BATNA is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. In other words, when you're walking into a negotiation, you should know what your option B is outside of that negotiation, and then that's always going to drive your negotiation stance. So it's a great book. Recommend you checking it out. I want to thank them for letting me borrow the title. I also want to thank Bernadette Kuharczyk, who is going to be my co-presenter. I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bernadette. So she's going to have a discussion on a different topic, which is virtual town halls. A little bit of the background to this, I'm a huge fan of peer presentations at these types of conferences, and the ability for us to have more than one in this space was just too good to pass up. So I'm happy for Bernadette to be my co-presenter today, and I want to thank her for what she's contributing. While I'm doling out thank yous, I want to thank you to GMIS. Normally, I'm used to GMIS through GMIS Illinois, which is our state organization. So this is actually my first interaction with GMIS International, but they've been wonderful to work with. And in fact, the GMIS team has been so easy that I was pleasantly surprised to find out that there was no PowerPoint format for the presentations. So that was a great opportunity for me to explore what's available in PowerPoint and have a little fun with that. I will say that if this is the last year where they let presenters come up with their own formats, you'll know who to blame. I also want to say I was really disappointed, of course, not to be in Philadelphia. This was going to be my first visit to a GMIS International meeting because, you know, look, these presentations are nice, but the best part of these conferences is commiserating with your peers, especially other government IT managers, because who can appreciate things that we go through except our peers? It's hard for the people who we work with at our governments to understand the complexity of the IT role. It's hard for the people who we love and hang out with outside of work to understand the difficulty of our role. But here with our peers, we can all commiserate. And because really, I think we can all agree that our job sucks sometimes. Now, sometimes, right? Sometimes. I'd like to say that, you know, sometimes our jobs can be incredibly fulfilling, but sometimes our job sucks. We, as IT managers for government, have inherited a technical debt from the past. No matter what your situation is, you are dealing with legacy situations built from the past. One of the ones that was in my intro is that at the city of Urbana, we still run some mainframe applications that were written by our own in-house programmers back in the 80s and have hundreds of users across the county. So everybody is dealing with that. Then you've got all the stuff that Dave was just talking about in his presentation. You've got all these cybersecurity needs that were leveraged upon us. I mean, I saw his eye chart of responsibilities that we have. That was eye-watering. We also have the work from home initiative, right? All of a sudden, oh, and everybody's got to connect from the outside, not to mention trying to be a smart city at the same time. So it's always new initiatives and problems that are coming at us from every part of the organization. Now, partly, I will admit, this is a self-inflicted wound because we are problem solvers. That's, for many of us, one of the ways that we got into our job is because we like dealing with problems and solving stuff. But the problem with that is it's a world with lots of problems, especially in government. Other people recognize this about us and bring their problems to us. And the problem with that is that we have a tendency to take on too much. And that's both ourselves as IT managers, but also, of course, the teams that we manage and the number of projects that we're overseeing. So this really brings me to the point of my presentation, which is how to say no. So I do have an agenda. The agenda has 3 items. I'm going to talk first about the importance of saying no. Then I'm going to talk about procurement specifications. Because if you don't know me, there's one thing I like to talk about, it's procurement specifications. And then we're going to talk about how to say no. Okay, so picture this. Someone comes back from a conference excited about some shiny, cool new technology that they saw. I think each of you can probably imagine a department or a person at your organization who could do this. Maybe it's you. Maybe you're the one who's going to talk to some corporate member during the side presentations and kind of excited about some kind of cool thing that you have to have. Well, that is the problem because there's always something new, right? Each new thing, though, that we get has to coexist with all the other things that we already have. So if it's software that we're going to get, it's going to have to communicate and share data with others, or are we looking at redundant data entry? If it's hardware, will it work with the rest of our infrastructure? What's the maintenance plan? What's going to be the replacement cost? And even if it's just a cloud system, well, it's still another set of user accounts to manage and another place for our data to become decentralized. As IT pros, we know that each new component that we get is going to increase the complexity of everything else. So I would encourage you as IT managers that sometimes our job is to give a healthy dose of skepticism. Now look, this part's actually kind of easy for me because personally, I'm a Luddite. I hate technology and technology doesn't like me very much either. I started my career as a software tester, and breaking technology is a wonderful skill to have for that, but ever since then, it's just been a plague for me. So even if you're somebody who likes technology, think about it this way. It's not the technology. Get excited for the solution and the benefits that's going to bring, not whatever technology it is. Not every problem that we have to deal with requires the slickest solution out there. Sometimes Google Forms is the right tool for the job. Because no matter what technology you are trying to use, I have an ironclad rule for you. It's always harder than you expect. This is true no matter what the sales rep tells you or anybody else. Any kind of thing that you're doing is going to be more difficult than you're expecting. And a part of that is because it's not the product that's the solution, it's the implementation of the product. Buying it isn't going to solve the problem. Getting people to successfully use it, that's the challenge. So it's going to require testing and training and maintenance and data conversions and integration and all the other things that has to go on for it to be a successfully working part of your solution. In fact, I have a rule on my team that if we're dealing with something and we haven't had any problems yet, then we're not far enough along. Because there's always going to be something that I call the messy middle. At the beginning of the middle phase of the project is when you start finding the stuff you overlooked on the front end, or the things that you didn't quite understand on the front end and now turn out to be so much harder than you expected. I do want to say this is a necessary part of the project. There's always going to be problems. So it's good to reach the messy middle because now at least you're starting to uncover those problems. The one danger, of course, is that you stop before you find them all. So make sure you continue plowing through. It's also important to plow through the messy middle because you gotta finish projects. You can't just get frustrated because they get difficult and then put them on the side. And the reason for that is because more projects are gonna come along. And if you're not done with the prior stuff, then it's just gonna stack up. And here, of course, I'm not just talking about you, I'm talking about your team. And that's important because at the end of the day, you can't do it all. Now, this is a little bit frustrating. This is the peer-to-peer commiserating part. Expectations on government IT managers are through the roof. And we're getting it from all sides. And a lot of people have a hard time saying no to elected officials, or saying no to department heads, or saying no to even their own supervisors. But it's demoralizing for you and your team to have so many unfinished projects and new ones coming at you all the time, because there's always something new. And it's always harder than you expect. And that's why it's important to be able to say no. Okay, so we're going to talk about how to say no soon. But first, I want to change gears here and actually speak out to the GMIS corporate members who might be watching this talk. It is true for you too. You also have a hard time saying no, and you can't do it all either. And that brings us to procurement specifications. So part of my bio is that I used to work for a government finance system vendor, and I had a lot of roles at that vendor. But one thing I did throughout my career a lot was to respond to government RFPs. There is a mistaken perception in the vendor community that saying no to a specification in an RFP or in a procurement is a bad thing. In fact, I had experiences like this. As the product specialist, I would fill out answers to the specifications and then send that for review to the sales exec. And then the sales exec would call me up and say something like, well, we're only at like 87% on the yeses. Can you bump that up to a 90? I want to tell you, it's a good thing to say no to procurement specifications because primarily it's a specification, not a requirement. Look, corporate members, I wish you were in the room sometimes when we're writing specifications. A lot of it is people dreaming about an imaginary system. Because if we're buying it in government, we either don't have it or the one we have is so woefully out of date that we have no idea what a current system does. So let's review for a moment why we write procurement specifications. Yes, we write procurement specifications to be able to compare proposals. That is a legitimate use, and the sales execs were right about that. But what they got wrong was in thinking that every specification is equal. They are not equally weighted. Some of them are much more critical than others. More importantly, we want to define scope for the project because we want to know up front what things can be done and which ones can't be done. And one of the primary reasons to define that up front is to avoid contractual issues. None of us want to get mired in a he said, she said about what the system can do and can't do, or the solution of any kind. And specifications help us to set user expectations because ultimately we want a successful project. And a successful project is when the end solution meets or exceeds user expectations. So it's really important for us to know up front what we can have and what we don't get. Unfortunately, though, this is not how specifications are used. And in fact, what we have is instead the game of specification answers. Now, the game is played by the corporate members in terms of saying yes. So normally, this is where I would have little audience participation of my talk. That not being feasible on this platform, I have asked my good friend Rick Kazenko, who is the IT director for the Village of Plainfield, to play along with me. Rick is also the president of GMIS Illinois, so kudos to him and thanks to him for participating. So Rick is now going to ask me a question, much as I would see on a specification, and I'm going to wear the vendor hat and answer that question. So, Rick?
Will the system notify an employee to refresh their data 2 weeks before their anniversary date?
Yes, let's see. The solution, the system could run a report that you would use to email people. Yes, yeah, we can do that. Try again, Rick.
Can we select service requests based on work type and location and create a single work order?
Let's see. Yes. Let's see. You can create a work order from the first service request, and then you can add the rest one by hand. Yes. Well, obviously, these are egregious examples and twisting words to manipulate the process. But what I want to do, and here I'm shifting back to talking to our GMIS government members, I want to give you just a few quick tips about writing specifications where you can eliminate some of that game playing. So first of all, avoid the words ability to. This is really a weak phrase and leaves gray area about what's going to be happening. So for example of a bad specification, the system has the ability to track permits by development district. Well, if I wanted to say yes to that, there's a lot of ways I could manipulate the process and still say, yeah, we do that. But a better specification here would be to say that the system automatically links permits to a development district based on the geolocation. So if you want some specific operational functionality, state that. Next tip, clearly identify the actor. If the system should be doing something automatically, state that. And the opposite, of course, is that somebody has to do it by hand. So for example, a bad specification here would be the ability to route a purchase order for approval based on object code. Well, that might fall to somebody to do manually and then have to forward them on to the various people. Instead, state it as the system automatically sends purchase orders to the appropriate approver based on the object code. So just clearly identifying the actor will take away some of that game playing. And finally, one more tip, keep in mind Boolean logic. I shouldn't have to tell this crowd about this, but and versus or matters. And I will admit, I was guilty of this sometimes myself. If there was an or statement and we did one of those things, I would say yes, because it says or. So when you're writing your specifications, keep this in mind. So for example, an example of a bad one is the ability to have vendor numbers be system generated or assigned manually. Well, I think this is a real life one. I think what they meant was the and version, which is best written as two separate requirements or two separate specifications. Sorry, caught myself. That the system generates vendor numbers if the user requests, and separately that the user can specify the vendor number if they want to. Okay, back to our agenda. So we talked about procurement specifications, can't stop me from doing that. But now I want to come back to how to say no. And here again, I'm talking to everybody, but really my talk is directed at the GMIS government members who are in the difficult position of managing all these requests for our time and having to gracefully tell sometimes, hey, I'm sorry, we can't do that for you. So let's talk about a couple tips for saying no. The first one is to say no politely. I will admit, this is an area that took me some hard lessons to learn, but it's still kind of a challenge for me too when I get stressed. There are levels of politeness that are easier to achieve when we have less going on, and when we get really busy, sometimes we get a little short. Well, this is why it's important to back up and understand that we're dealing with our coworkers in a long-term relationship. And you're going to have to work with people after you tell them no. So it's good for us to be open and communicative, and most importantly, to talk to them in person. Some of us as IT managers like to hide behind email, but this is really a conversation that is best had in person. Now, obviously, in today or the COVID age, it's a little more difficult sometimes to have these conversations in person. So a secondary way would be a Zoom call or a phone call, but it's really important to have that two-way dialogue. You want to explain your rationale for saying no, and you want to give that person a chance to talk and maybe bring up some facts that you weren't aware of. The worst way to say no is with an email. Now, I'm going to contradict myself in a few minutes and tell you that sometimes you should send an email, but the important point is you should send that email after you've had the verbal conversation, maybe just to document that information. Okay, the next tip on saying no is that you can say no with administrative steps. Now, there's a fine line here. You don't want to abuse the budgeting and procurement processes. You want to embrace them. So let's go back to that person who came back from the conference all excited about some cool new technology. You have the opportunity, well, first of all, hope that they come to see you, because if they go and buy some kind of technology solution without talking to IT, that's a separate problem. And you need to build yourself into the process so that you're not just getting solutions that have already been purchased handed to you. But let's assume that they are coming to you to talk about it ahead of time. This is a good chance for you to then say, oh, okay, great. Well, let's explore your solution. First of all, let's find out some other vendors who do the same thing and get some quotes. Then you can help them prepare a budget request. Once the budget is approved, you can help them plan for a procurement process, which could involve specifications and an RFP, and so on through the proper steps of the process. Now, at some point during this process, they may sober up and realize that that technology solution isn't worth all this work. That's their decision, and a very appropriate one, because sometimes things seem cool, but then after a little bit of a cool off time, it's not as urgent. Now, one final note here, don't be a hypocrite. If you're going to be using administrative steps to push other people through a process, you have to follow that process yourself. And in fact, you have to be an expert in that process. So just a quick note on that. One of my favorite ways to say no is with boundaries. So you can do some proactive no's by setting the rules up front and then adhering to them and letting people decide for themselves how they want to respond. So two examples of this. One is when people approach me or team members of my team in the hallways with IT issues, we say, hey, look, I'll tell you what, and this is an honest answer, I'm going to forget this between now and the time I sit down at my desk. So send an email to the IT help desk so we can get it in the queue. That sets a boundary for those kind of walk-up issues, and not every issue gets sent to the help desk. So again, some issues are maybe not that urgent. Another example of how I use boundaries personally is with vendor contacts. Like you, like all of us, we get contacted by vendors all the time. If a vendor calls me or emails me, they get an automated response explaining that I take vendor meetings on Thursdays from 4 to 5 p.m. That is the 1 hour a week I dedicate to this, so that the other 39 hours out of the week, I am not going to read their white papers, answer their phone calls, or look at their emails. This actually has been, to me, surprisingly successful, because vendors respect that hour and go ahead and book me, and I feel guilt-free for the other 39 hours a week that I ignore them. Which brings us to another interesting one. What if somebody comes to you with a valid requirement that is actually urgent and needs to be done? Well, sometimes you have to say no by saying no to existing tasks. This is a good conversation to have with your direct supervisor or an oversight board, or maybe even just with your team, to sit down and look at all the things that you're working on and figure out which ones can be deferred or, let's be honest here, might actually fall off altogether. I call this the power of prioritization. And it's a really effective way to both share with people how many things your team is working on and also to have a proactive discussion about what's the most critical. Finally, my advice to you in saying no is to say no clearly. You might think you're being polite with a kind of passive aggressive, oh, well, we'll see what I can do. But anything that's not a clear no is going to be a problem later on, because people might think that they have given you an assignment or you have accepted what they've asked you to do, and you might think differently. So it's critical for you to be clear with people when you're saying no, explain the reasons why. And this is the situation where I recommend sometimes a follow-up email after your conversation can be a good thing to document the reasons for your no. All right, well, that led me through all the designs possible in PowerPoint. So therefore, this must be the end of my presentation. Very quickly, what you're seeing, the website on the screen is my blog site. Some of the things that I talked about here are actually condensed versions of topics that I've written about on my blog. So mostly I write about government IT. I also sometimes write about movies and the Beatles, but mostly government IT. So feel free to reach out to me through that, or please check out some of the other pieces I've written. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Bernadette.